welcome everyone to our seminar today. We're really glad that you had the chance to join us. Our topic is going to be recapping SEC seminar last week. We're going to focus on essential compliance and cybersecurity takeaways. So this is a portion of the seminar that they held last week. If you have other questions about that, I highly recommend afterwards getting in touch with Liz at SEC Compliance Solutions. Obviously, that day covered a lot more than just cybersecurity. My name is Simon Eyre. I'm the CISO here at Drawbridge. I have worked at Drawbridge now coming up to 5 years. So it'll be 5 years in the spring. My career spans over 20 years working in cybersecurity and technology in the alternative investment space. Liz, thank you very much for joining us today. Please go ahead and introduce yourself too.
So my name is Liz Capo, and I'm the founder of SEC Compliance Solutions, and we offer compliance consulting services to registered investment advisors. And I've been offering compliance consulting services since 2004. And I'm excited to do this panel with Simon. We actually have a lot of mutual clients. So, and I think that we have a lot of great information to provide you guys today.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liz. So really to sort of set the foundation as to what the seminar was last week. Well, very much on the back of the SEC's exam priorities that released just at the end of October, the idea of the seminar was to give an opportunity to really open communications with the industry and allow people to submit questions in that they would answer at the seminar. They covered a lot of the priorities that are in the 2025 exam priorities publication as well. So it was really a combination of the two. That was the idea, I think, behind this. They focused heavily on reinforcing the existing rules and in particular what they'll be assessing in those priorities. What the seminar wasn't, which I think many of us were sort of hoping secretly we'd get a little bit out of, was what's happening with some of the proposed rules in the future. It was very clear the SEC has focused their efforts on the existing rules, which in some cases have just been recently updated as well. Reg SP being the obvious one, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. So the primary focus, as I said, is on the cybersecurity portion of the seminar. And so the topics that they really covered off also repeated pretty much verbatim in the exam priorities. Their focus this year is very much going to be around the traditional cybersecurity expectations at investors, things like policies and procedures, governance practices, how the cybersecurity is overall managed, data loss prevention techniques, your typical account management and things like that. So all the very classic cyber categories that the SEC cares about. In terms of additional new things or expanded priorities, there's definitely a focus on workflow, and probably internationally, there's a favorite expression of operational resilience at the moment. And by that, we mean not just what are the disaster recovery characteristics of a particular system, but overall, how does a business learn and understand from an operational perspective, if a system is unavailable, how are they going to work around it? What are the resilience practices that can be put in place? So the exam priorities and the seminar both focused on really delivering this operational resilience perspective. And their recommendation was very much to look at it from a workflow. What are your sources of data? How are you processing and ingesting that? What third parties are dealing with that data? And then where is it stored? Where is it transmitted? Really to sort of have a holistic view of the business to help you identify where those cyber risks are. They also talked about dealing with business continuity planning, incident response plans. They are going to be heavily influenced in the next 12 to 18 months by the amended Reg SP requirements as well. You know, perhaps Liz, you could talk a little bit about what's happened under Reg SP. The old one from 2000 was very basic, very high level. But the changes that are happening with Reg SP that they talked about are much more significant.
Yeah, absolutely. So Reg SP has been amended, and just so you guys know, it's effective for large advisory firms and investment companies and broker-dealers by December of 2025, and for smaller advisors by June of 2026. So you have some time to work through the rule and figure out how you can implement those requirements within your policies and your operations. And there's a couple of main areas within Reg SP that you need to be made aware of. One is Reg SP explicitly requires firms to have a written incident response plan, which has some specifics around when you provided notice in the event of a breach, specifically 30 days. And then there's very specific requirements of what needs to go into that notice. And then one item that I find interesting that you probably should start working with your vendors on maybe sooner rather than later is they're expecting you to have an understanding with your third-party vendors that you're selecting that if they have a breach that impacts your clients, they're letting you know within 72 hours. And so you'll probably want to revisit your contractual requirements and see if you can rework some of that into your contracts, and then also fold that into your due diligence of your service providers. And then also with your incident response plan, just like anything else in your compliance program, once you have it in place, you don't just sit it and forget it. They want to see that you're reviewing that and testing that to make sure that it's still reasonably designed for your firm. And then I think another big category that got rolled into the amendment with Reg SP is around the oversight and due diligence of your service providers. So you do need to have a sophisticated, robust process for due diligence, both initially and ongoing. It needs to take into consideration factors as to how they're protecting the information that they have access to, their business continuity, what happens to your firm if they go out of business, and what does that look like for you? And then, as I mentioned, also the making sure that there's a clear understanding that they're going to report breaches to you within 72 hours. And then you need to make sure that your firm has effectively documented your service provider due diligence review. So you can't just say, yes, we do it, and they're going to be okay with it. You've got to have substantiated documentation to support that. Simon, I know your firm helps other advisors with service provider due diligence. I know I've been the recipient of some of those. And so I would love to hear your perspective, like what you think overall firms are doing good, not doing good, just kind of like some good best practice things to think about for firms as they're like trying to figure out how they enhance that due diligence program.
Yeah, I think so. One of the interesting things that came up in the seminar as well was a discussion about essential vendors. And I think it was an interesting choice of words. We tend to hear the term critical or material vendors and third-party suppliers and things like that. But I guess it's the same approach here, the essential vendors. So they were almost suggesting that there should be this correct tiering and documented tiering of the vendors. Who are the ones that, if you have a breach, are going to be the ones that need to report to you? Where is your essential data being processed? And that. So there was almost a bit more due diligence on the part of the manager, I think, that needs to be done before you just rush into doing the vendor risk. Traditionally you may come up with a whiteboard and write down the name of the vendors, but they want a little bit more thought process into why you've selected those particular vendors to have the risk assessment done, and then understanding what the sort of cyber baseline, the cyber standard is that you expect out of them. Traditionally, I think the easiest way to think of that is very much, if you in-house that service and applied your own cybersecurity policies, this would be the standard. We would expect, all staff to be using multi-factor authentication, that all data would be encrypted at rest, those sort of things like that. So therefore, applying and making sure that those same standards are met or exceeded, which was another kind of term that they use, meet and exceed the expected standards of cybersecurity. So I think from that perspective, what they were openly talking about, certainly there was expecting to have this baseline standards and the tiering of the vendors as to really documenting which ones are doing the critical functions of the business. And then, as you mentioned, with Reg SP specifically, they also highlighted the fact that meeting those breach notifications are going to be important. There were a couple of other terms as well that are coming with Reg SP, breach assistance. So not just simply telling you we've had a breach, but assisting with either the recovery or the data protection measures that need to be in place. And then contractually as well, things like exit strategies, making sure that your data belongs to you and that you're able to remove yourself if you wish to sever contracts and move with another provider. There's another layer to that as well, like the operational resilience aspect that I already spoke about. What if that vendor has the outage? What if they go bust and simply turn off the lights? How can you continue business operations until you're able to either recover, your primary services with them or anything like that? So yeah, there's a lot of discussion about that, specifically focused on the outsourced providers.
Yeah, I would add to that, the other thing that I take away from this, they might not have explicitly stated this, is the importance of compliance being involved in the selection of your vendors. I think sometimes, especially with pretty large firms, there's multiple departments and people doing different things. And sometimes compliance isn't aware of a new service provider until maybe after it's been selected, even sometimes a year later after it's been selected. So your firm needs to make sure that compliance is involved from the onset so that it's very clear that they're involved with that due diligence process.
The other part to that they mentioned as well was that term shadow IT. So if you're dealing with outsourced providers and businesses using vendors that aren't necessarily have gone through that due diligence and risk assessment process, classifying them under this sort of shadow IT umbrella. And of course, if that happens, you've lost all control where data may be saved, how data retention policies can be applied. They're on systems that aren't within the formal control of the business. So you really lose control at that point.
Yeah. The other thing I found interesting is not in the operation resiliency discussion, but at the very end of the outreach, they kind of talked about some hot topics, with artificial intelligence being one of them. And I know there's a lot of firms out there that are figuring out how to implement that within their firm. One of the more common ones I'm seeing is note-taking AI, for client meetings and stuff. And I think they focused more on like the disclosures around it, right? But I also feel like it folds into due diligence. And so I was just curious, from your perspective, what firms would need to consider when they're considering AI and the due diligence around those types of softwares and technologies.
One of the interesting things here is that it proves that cybersecurity is not a one-time operation. And they did mention that as well, that it should be a continuous and adapting to the latest risks of the business. And AI is a perfect example of that, where your risk assessments need to adapt to the new introduction of technology. So for them, they wanted to understand that your risk assessments were adapting. If you were using AI, that you've clearly understood the risks that bring to data loss controls, that it can open up some of the traditional boundaries that we have with things like permissions and controls around that. You get a bit of a gray area as to how AI may be processing company info and who has access to that data now. Interestingly, they also brought up the concept of AI washing, which was perhaps more on the marketing side of the business. But what they clearly showed there is, just like we had with greenwashing, firms are advertising they are leaders in AI, that they've got the first approved AI model by the SEC, I think was one of the examples they gave. And in truth, it was all sort of traditional data processing and not really using the technology, or simply factually completely incorrect. So I think foundationally, people need to understand the new risks and adapt from that, and then also ensure that the technology is truly correctly implemented before necessarily running straight out to the marketing side of things.
Yeah, 100%. The other thing that I took out of the outreach is they said, okay, if you really want to know what we're focusing on and what we're concerned about and what you need to make sure you're implementing to meet our expectations, then you need to pay attention to what we're pushing out there publicly. And I'm rephrasing, of course, the terms that they use, that they have, for instance, they have risk alerts, and you could just simply Google SEC risk alert and it will take you right to the page. And those are a culmination of usually a result of all the exams that they've conducted. And they're saying, we've examined all these advisors and we're finding common issues, and we want to make sure that you're aware of it so that you have the opportunity to correct it. So make sure you're always staying abreast of those publications. And there are some that are cybersecurity focused. I don't think more recently. I want to say there's some back in 2020 and 2019 and 2015.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and the things that I think I've seen them cover are like making sure you have patch management, multi-factor authentication is a huge one. They just expect you to have that implemented. A strong password policy that's been documented in your procedures and communicated to all your staff. They want to see ongoing training, which I think is something we should spend some time on too. I think if you're using third parties, making sure those security features are being reviewed to make sure that they're, protecting your information. But so make sure you pay attention to those risk alerts. But then they also mentioned enforcement actions. And I think those are like the greatest opportunities for us to learn from other people's mistakes and go, okay, clearly that's really important. We'll make sure that we're doing that as well. And I think we've seen that with off-channel communications, of course. I mean, that's been like the huge topic right now, but I think there was a recent one in October, right?
Yeah, so the October enforcement action, that was against a few tech companies and names that in our industry we know quite well. Eyre, the telecommunications company, Mimecast was another one of them. I forget the other two now. And what they had done here, and it was actually on the back of another breach, which also the SEC were investigating, which was the SolarWinds case of software within the SolarWinds manufacturing, the software development of its products being injected with malicious code, which was then distributed out to companies like Mimecast and Avaya. And this is a sort of thing actually that the new updated Reg SP is designed to combat. And so these are public companies, so it will come down to registered investment advisors as well. But they obviously reported the breach that had happened, but they had very much downplayed what had happened to their businesses and minimized the whole damage that had gone and happened, obviously trying to reduce the reputational damage to the business. And this is one of the key risks that we find for businesses under the cyber umbrella. It's financial and it's reputational. And they'd try to minimize it, and the SEC had realized this, and so they'd enforced action against them and they'd fine them. But there's another one recently as well with record keeping. So that falls under the availability, the integrity of data. It's part of cyber, and that's been directly enforced against, I think it was 8 registered investment advisors and some fairly small funds that were caught up in that one too.
Yeah, no, and that one's a big one, definitely. And that's just a topic across the whole industry right now. And then I think another, they talked about cybersecurity training and the importance of having process in place where employees are regularly being trained on the firm's policies and potential threats and best practices. And I personally think that's your best deterrent against threats, because correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, but almost all threats start with some kind of human action. And so, the more you can drill that awareness into your employees, the better protected you are as a firm. But then I also want to emphasize the importance is if when you hire new people, to get them trained immediately, because in my personal experience, I've had 3 clients now where there's been not necessarily a breach of client data, but basically what happened is a new hire was contacted by a bad actor via an email. It looks like it came from the boss. And I think the new hire just wants to please. And the boss says, don't tell anybody, but I want you to go out and buy gift cards. I'm going to surprise everybody and then scratch off the back and give me the code. And it seems like common sense, but I also understand the concept of a new hire just wanting to please the boss and not ask questions. And I think they use social engineering to identify who the new hires are, because we're so eager to post on social media. But I know you guys offer I think you do cybersecurity training, right? So yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about what works. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And they said this on the call as well. For as far as training goes, there were 2 things that they thought people needed to focus on. One was training being specific to the role of the person. So if you're in a software development team, the software training should be focused on creating secure code. If you're on investor relations, if you're on a sort of client-facing position, there should be more of that social engineering and impersonation training. But they were very focused that new employees were the #1 focus of all the breaches that they had seen. Your example there is so common that there must be a significant percentage of gift cards that are sold fraudulently, that are actually measurable in the way that the marketing of gift cards goes. It is so common. It's amazing that it still goes on. So they mentioned other things as well. I mean, we've talked about MFA, we've talked about third parties quite a lot in shadow IT. They brought up that another significant breach that they still see at the SEC is business email compromise, usually linked to inconsistent MFA being deployed. Somebody at the top decides they don't want their MFA, and unfortunately, those are the accounts that get compromised. So it's their email that's compromised. But also people still falling for impersonation, fake email addresses, typo domains, and things like that. So the SEC made a point of saying that these are still, like you said, that human element needs to be the last barrier, the last defense that's in here. Interestingly, when they also talked about, in terms of their expectations, that you should be able to benchmark yourself against your peers, which, without sort of blowing Drawbridge's trumpet too much, is something that Drawbridge does do with benchmarking your cybersecurity standards against each other. And that can be a real challenge for firms to do, for an asset manager to understand how their cyber program is progressing. And so looking at services like Drawbridge can really help you benchmark yourselves. So that's another interesting one. I thought that was rather timely for services that we're now doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think cybersecurity is an area that you definitely need support. Like, I just don't see how firms could necessarily just do it themselves, because, the technology is changing rapidly. The bad actors are getting smarter. And there's nothing more valuable, in my opinion, than learning from the collective. So when you work with another expert that works in a space that you work in, you basically just get all of that knowledge in that one direct relationship. And I think it's really important to have somebody independently review your systems and your softwares. And there's all different types of testing, right? There's phishing testing, vulnerability, penetration. But I just think that's the expectation from the SEC, but also not just to satisfy them, but just to protect your firm from any kind of reputational risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, I suppose, as a sort of closing point there, you're absolutely right that the SEC is not doing this just to generate money by being able to enforce and commit fines. They genuinely want to protect the investor. And by establishing these cyber baselines, they're doing that. There's nothing outlandish to what they suggested on the seminar. The next year's 2025 exam priorities publication is a logical next step, given advances like AI and where the current laws and Reg SP is going to take managers. So yeah, I think from that perspective, it all very much made sense. And their proposals were properly measured and controlled. I don't know if you've got any other closing thoughts.
I will just say, I think, takeaways are, just make sure you're staying educated with SEC publications, and you can sign up to get those publications into your email box. So subscribe to that for risk alerts and enforcement cases. And then make sure you give yourself plenty of time to work through the implementation of the Reg SP changes so that you can thoughtfully implement those requirements.
Thank you very much, Liz, for joining us today.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Please reach out to us if you have any other follow-up questions.
Thanks, everyone.